February 23, 1945, Iwo Jima, 1,000 yards from where 6 Marines are about to raise a flag on top of Mount Suribachi in a photograph that will become the most famous image of the entire war. Corporal Herschel Williams is crawling through black volcanic sand with a 70-pound flamethrower strapped to his back, alone, toward a network of concrete pillboxes that has already stopped American tanks cold. 4 riflemen were assigned to cover him. By the end of the day, 2 of them will be dead, killed protecting a man who will keep going anyway. For the next 4 hours, Corporal Williams will crawl forward under machine gun fire, destroy a pillbox, crawl back to his own lines for a fresh flamethrower, and crawl forward again, over and over, until 7 Japanese fortified positions that had pinned down his entire company are gone. He will mount 1 pillbox directly and fire his weapon through its air vent. He will be charged by Japanese soldiers with fixed bayonets and burn them down with a single burst before they reach him. Most of that day, by his own account decades later, he will barely remember at all. This is the true story of the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient of the Second World War, a farm boy from West Virginia who was once told by his own mother that he was too young to go to war, and who ended up doing something on a Pacific beach that even he could never fully explain afterward. Herschel Woodrow Williams was born on October 2, 1923, on a dairy farm in Fairmont, West Virginia, the youngest of 11 children. Though only 5 of his siblings survived past childhood, the rest lost to the 1918 influenza pandemic and other hardships common to rural families of that era. His father died when Herschel was young, and the family kept the dairy farm running through sheer necessity. Every child expected to work from an early age, milking cows, hauling feed, doing the kind of physical labor that builds a particular type of quiet, stubborn endurance into a person long before anyone hands them a rifle. West Virginia farm life during the Depression did not leave much room for idle time or idle dreaming, and Herschel grew up understanding that survival, for his family and for the animals they depended on, required showing up every single day whether you felt like it or not. When war broke out in Europe and tensions with Japan escalated through the late 1930s, Herschel, like a lot of teenage boys watching the news reach even the most rural corners of the country, wanted to enlist as soon as he possibly could. At 17 years old, he tried to join the Marine Corps and was turned away, not because the Corps rejected him, but because his own mother refused to sign the parental consent form required for a minor to enlist. She wasn't willing to send her youngest son off to a war that hadn't even reached American shores yet, and Herschel, frustrated but still underage, was forced to wait. In the meantime, he took work driving a taxi and later a truck for a construction company. Ordinary jobs that kept him busy, but did nothing to quiet the same restlessness that had pushed him to try enlisting in the first place. Pearl Harbor was attacked in December of 1941, and by May of 1943, with the war now fully underway and Herschel old enough to enlist without his mother's signature, he joined the United States Marine Corps Reserve. He trained in San Diego, California, initially assigned to a tank battalion before eventually being transferred into demolitions, where he was trained as a flamethrower operator, a specialty that came with a particular kind of risk most infantrymen didn't have to think about. A flamethrower operator carried a tank of pressurized flammable fuel strapped directly to his own back, walking or crawling toward enemy positions close enough to use it effectively, which also meant close enough that a single well-placed enemy round into that fuel tank could turn the operator himself into a fireball. It was one of the most dangerous specialties in the entire Marine Corps, and Herschel Williams, the farm boy who'd spent his childhood hauling feed and milking cows before sunrise, took to it anyway. He shipped overseas in late 1943, and in January of 1944, he was assigned to the 21st Marines, 3rd Marine Division, in time to see his first combat during the invasion of Guam later that same year, an operation that gave him his first real experience using a flamethrower against dug-in Japanese positions and taught him lessons about patience and terrain that would matter enormously on the battlefield still waiting for him. By February of 1945, the 3rd Marine Division was part of the massive invasion force assembling to take Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island whose airfields Marine commanders believed were essential to supporting the coming air campaign against mainland Japan. Iwo Jima's defenders, under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had spent the better part of a year turning the island into one of the most heavily fortified pieces of ground American forces would face anywhere in the Pacific War. An interconnected system of tunnels, bunkers, and reinforced concrete pillboxes, some of them buried so deep and built so thick that they proved almost completely resistant to naval bombardment and aerial bombing in the days leading up to the invasion. Williams landed on Iwo Jima on February 21, 1945, 2 days into an invasion that was already among the bloodiest the Marine Corps had ever undertaken, casualties mounting by the hour as American infantry tried to push forward across open volcanic ash against an enemy they usually couldn't even see. By February 23rd, Williams's unit found itself completely stalled in front of a dense network of Japanese pillboxes, reinforced concrete positions with steel rods embedded in their walls, built low to the ground and camouflaged so effectively that American tanks trying to support the infantry advance couldn't identify targets fast enough to knock them out, while the pillboxes themselves poured machine gun fire into anything that moved in front of them. Marines who tried to advance directly into that fire were being cut down in numbers that made the entire operation grind to a halt. Tanks maneuvered forward and backward, unable to find a clear lane through the buried mines and fortified positions, essentially useless against an enemy dug in this deep and this well protected. A company commander, desperate for any solution that might break the stalemate, asked if anyone had a flamethrower and the nerve to use it. Herschel Williams volunteered. He was given 4 riflemen, 2 automatic riflemen, and 2 regular riflemen, whose entire job was to lay down covering fire and try to keep him alive while he crawled forward alone toward the first pillbox. Williams himself said later that the mechanics of what happened next are largely gone from his memory, a blank space in his mind where 4 hours of some of the most sustained individual combat of the entire Pacific War should be. What survives are fragments, vivid enough that they never left him for the rest of his life, and the official record pieced together from the men who watched it happen around him. He strapped on the 70-pound flamethrower and began crawling forward across open ground toward the first pillbox, bullets kicking up dirt and ricocheting off the metal fuel tank on his own back the entire way, and later admitted that he never fully understood why crawling closer to the enemy position actually made him a harder target to hit than staying at a distance, but the instinct kept him alive long enough to reach it. He reached the first pillbox, got close enough to bring the flamethrower to bear, and eliminated it. Then, rather than staying forward to push toward the next target immediately, he crawled back through the same fire-swept ground to his own lines to refuel, because a flamethrower's fuel supply lasted only a matter of seconds of continuous use, meaning that destroying even one pillbox often exhausted the tank and required a return trip for a serviced unit before he could do it again. This became the pattern for the next 4 hours. Crawl forward under fire, destroy a position, crawl back through the same exposed ground, retrieve or wait for a refueled flamethrower, crawl forward again. 6 separate times over that 4-hour span, Williams made this same round trip, exposing himself to renewed enemy fire on every single pass, both going toward the pillboxes and coming back for more fuel, an almost incomprehensible level of sustained exposure to danger that most soldiers experience once or twice in an entire battle, not repeatedly by choice over the course of a single afternoon. While Williams made those repeated trips, his 4 assigned riflemen stayed forward with him, doing everything they could to suppress Japanese fire and protect him during the most exposed moments of each approach. Williams didn't know it in the moment, later saying the chaos of the fighting made it impossible to track everything happening around him in real time, but 2 of those 4 Marines were killed that day, giving their lives specifically in the effort to keep him alive long enough to keep destroying pillboxes. It's a detail that stayed with Williams for the rest of his life, once he learned the full extent of what those men had sacrificed to cover him, a debt he never described as fully repayable, no matter what recognition eventually came his way. 2 moments from that 4-hour engagement stood out clearly enough to make it into his official Medal of Honor citation, details vivid enough that Williams himself could recall them even through the blank spaces surrounding most of the day. At one point, rather than engaging a pillbox from a safe distance, Williams made the decision to climb directly onto the top of one of the fortified positions itself, mounting the structure while Japanese soldiers were still inside it, and inserted the nozzle of his flamethrower through the pillbox's air vent, killing the occupants and permanently silencing the machine gun that had been firing from inside it. At another point during those 4 hours, a group of Japanese soldiers attempted to stop him directly, charging at him with fixed bayonets in a desperate close-quarters attempt to kill him before he could bring his weapon to bear on their position. Williams turned his flamethrower on them and destroyed the charging soldiers with a single burst of flame before they were able to reach him, a moment of combat close enough and immediate enough that there would have been no time to think, only to react. By the time those 4 hours ended, Corporal Herschel Williams had personally destroyed 7 separate Japanese pillboxes, breaking the stalemate that had pinned down his entire company, and finally clearing a path for American tanks and infantry to continue their advance across that section of the island. He continued fighting through the remainder of the brutal, weeks-long campaign for Iwo Jima after that day, until March 6, 1945, when he was wounded and pulled out of the fighting, having survived roughly 5 weeks on one of the deadliest battlefields American forces would face anywhere during the entire Second World War. In October of 1945, President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Herschel Williams's neck at a ceremony at the White House, recognizing the 4 hours of sustained individual valor that had broken the deadlock in front of his company's position on Iwo Jima. Williams was discharged from the Marine Corps shortly afterward and returned home to West Virginia, but coming home did not mean the war was over for him in any meaningful sense. Like an enormous number of combat veterans of his generation, in an era with almost no vocabulary or support system for what today would immediately be recognized as post-traumatic stress, Williams struggled privately for years with the psychological weight of what he'd seen and done on that island, the blank spaces in his memory sitting alongside fragments so vivid he could never fully set them down. He has said that it wasn't until he found deeper religious faith in the 1960s, roughly 2 decades after Iwo Jima, that he began to find a real measure of peace with what he had survived and what it had cost the men around him, including the 2 riflemen who died covering his repeated trips across that fire-swept ground. Rather than retreating from public life once he found that peace, Williams spent the following decades building an entire second legacy around service to others. He went to work for the Veterans Administration, dedicating years to helping fellow former prisoners of war and veterans navigate the same systems and struggles he understood firsthand. He served as chaplain of the Medal of Honor Society for more than 30 years, a role that placed him at the center of the small, close-knit community of fellow recipients of the nation's highest military honor. And in his later years, he founded the Herschel Woody Williams Medal of Honor Foundation, an organization built specifically to honor Gold Star families, the parents, spouses, and children of service members killed in action, funding memorial monuments across the country and educational scholarships for the family members left behind by those losses. It was a mission that connected directly back to the 2 Marines who had died protecting him on Iwo Jima, a debt Williams spent much of the rest of his life trying to honor through the families of other fallen service members rather than his own recognition. As the decades passed, one by one, the other Medal of Honor recipients from the Second World War passed away, until Herschel Williams found himself in a position he had never sought and rarely spoke of directly, the last living Marine, and eventually the last living American of any branch, to hold the Medal of Honor for actions during World War II. He continued his foundation work and public advocacy for Gold Star families well into his 90s, a living connection to a war that was rapidly passing beyond living memory for most of the country. Herschel Woody Williams died on June 29, 2022, at the age of 98, the final surviving link to the millions of Americans who had earned that same honor during the Second World War and did not live to see how long their own stories would continue to matter to the country they'd fought for. Here's what always stays with me about those 4 hours on Iwo Jima. Herschel Williams did not destroy 7 pillboxes in one continuous, uninterrupted charge. He did it in stages, crawling forward into direct fire, succeeding, and then making the deliberate choice to crawl all the way back through that same fire, again and again, 6 separate times, simply to get another flamethrower and go back out and do it again. Every single one of those return trips was a fresh decision to go back into danger he had already survived once, when nobody would have blamed him for staying back after the first pillbox, or the second, or the fifth. And two of the men assigned to protect him during those repeated trips never made it home, a fact Williams carried for the rest of his very long life, turning it, decades later, into a foundation built entirely around honoring families like theirs. That's the part of this story that outlasts the medal itself. Not the 7 pillboxes, remarkable as that number is, but the 6 trips back into the fire to get the chance to destroy an 8th, a 9th, however many more it took, because the men counting on him hadn't given up, and neither did he.